Oh, I see.
Good morning. Today is Friday, the 7th of Tammuz, the 16th of July. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page at a time, one line at a time. Presently studying Shabbas Ch6, chapter 6. We're talking about the stuff chapter 6, 63b. The general discussion here is what you're allowed to wear on Shabbos and not allowed to wear on Shabbos. Although you think that you're allowed to wear anything you want on Shabbos, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions are the subject of our present day chapter. There are different reasons why there might be an exception, either because it's an item that is susceptible to being removed and you might carry it, or because although you're wearing it, you're not really wearing it, you're wielding it and it's a tool. For example, and if it's not for the look, it's not considered an ornament, then it would be considered carrying. Now, before we go into the Gemara, I want to make two important comments. First of all, we're dedicating today's learning Lila Nishmas Yisrael Shloime ben Reb David, Yisrael Shloime ben David. Just looking back at our plaque over here, and we have today is Zion of the yard site of our dear Mr. Peter Seil. He was our Gabbai and a member of the shul for quite a while. I would say he was our last active, or I would say he's the last three active survivors that were in our shul. Someone that was always gracious to share his experiences, and also just a sweet person, unassuming, happy and ready to help, a little bit of a Renaissance man, a special person to our shul. And so we'll dedicate today's learning Lila Nishmasai. I want to mention also that today will be the funeral for our dear Dr. Harosh's sister, Mazal, Bas, David, and Esther. And that's going to be at 12:30 here in Florida. And lastly, there was a big loss in the Chabad Hasidic community. Rabbi Yoel Kahn, who was the chief choser, he was the chief oral scribe of the Rebbe. So as you know, the Rebbe would speak with Fabrein. So during the weekdays, you could have a recording, pathetically, take notes. But how would you know what the Rebbe spoke of on Shabbos? The Rebbe would speak for hours on deep and divergent subjects of Torah, Hasidus, Kabbalah, Halacha, Parsha, Rashi, all deep. And so how would you recall that? So there was a team of oral scribes who were there listening and committed it to memory. And then after Shabbos, they would review it and then transcribe all those teachings. And some of them would then be edited by the Rebbe, and they were included in certain texts. Many of them are unedited. We have record of the different teachings of the Rebbe. Thanks to that, Rabbi Yoel Kahn was not just an oral scribe; he was also probably the teacher who taught the most of Chabad students who went on to become themselves, teachers in Hasidic thought. He was, and so he passed away yesterday at 91 years old. So his neshama shavan aliyah, and certainly he had a big school preserving and bringing a lot of Torah to the world. I wanted to mention that as well. He actually, it's in an interesting twist of fate. He was a young boy, or young man, I should say, in yeshiva during the previous Rebbe's reign as Rebbe, and he was from Russia, and they moved to Israel. They emigrated to Israel, and the yeshiva students would always want to be able to visit the Rebbe, then the previous Rebbe. And so finally, he got permission. He boarded a boat, and while he was on the ship, or right before he boarded the ship, but they didn't know about it, the previous Rebbe had passed on. So he ends up arriving fresh to America at the very, very beginning of the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe. And so his career spanned as a student and as a teacher and as an oral scribe, basically started immediately, although he didn't realize that upon arriving, he spent the entire career of the Rebbe, if you could say that. He unfortunately had no children. And so his legacy is his teachings, his writings, and his involvement in bringing the Rebbe's teachings to the world. Dr. Hammer, please.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Jake and his brother Simon were part of that team of oral scribes. Is that correct?
Correct. So in the final 10 years or so of that project, in the late 80s, or not less than 10 years, the 80s and 90s, until the Rebbe's stroke, where he was no longer able to speak and have the Farbrengens. So then Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, as he's now known, and Rabbi Simon Jacobson, who was his older brother, part of the team as well. And they were like trained under Rabbi Khan's tutelage. Rabbi Khan was the chief. I'll tell you something else. In Miami, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Gedol of the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in Miami on Alton is Rabbi Shapiro, himself a very distinguished and Chashav Rav and Rosh Yeshiva. And he too, in the 60s, until he was brought down to Miami as the Rosh Yeshiva, he too was part of that team. And as a Rosh Yeshiva, I think his strength was in the Rebbe's. He's a scholar of Chassidus and Gemara and Halacha, but I know that he was involved in transcribing many of the Rebbe's teachings about in Halacha and Nigla and in analyzing the Rebbe's unique style of studying and analyzing Rashi. The Rebbe had a unique way of understanding and developing the Rashi on the Chumash and Rashi on the Gemara, and so Rabbi Shapiro was involved in that process as well as being on the team of the oral scribes. And there were others over the course of the years. Rabbi Yoel Khan was the one who was from the beginning just about till the end. And so that is that. It's obviously a sad day. He was 91 years old, Kenan Har, so but he was active. Again, I don't know, the final months maybe he was ill, but he was literally active. He'd go to work, he'd go into the office, and he'd peck away at his typewriter till recently, or his computer, and he was actively writing Chassid works. And he was actually drafted, and then we'll get into the Gemara. He was drafted into creating an encyclopedia of Hasidic thought. And so he composed many volumes of that, and it's actually a work that's not yet done. And so I'm sure, but I believe he was involved in creating like the outline for the entire encyclopedia. And so I'm sure that's another work that's going to continue even following his passing. So that's that. And let's learn some Gemara. If you thought, so the last 2 days, any final comments before we go to our main agenda here, the study of the Gemara? All right, so our last 2 days have been a nice little, at least minor detour from some of the intense narratives that the Gemara gives us and we enjoy. And we've been having some Agadic conversations about, 2 days ago and 3 days ago was about the Chorban, what brought on the Chorban. Then yesterday we were talking about if tools of war and swords will be around when Mashiach comes, and we have the opportunity to discuss. There are some different opinions exactly what Mashiach will look like and how it will unfold, and if there are different phases. And we had the opportunity to, at the very least, acknowledge that we don't know all that much about the Olam Haba as we're describing Latid Lavo, a more spiritual state. It says Ayin whatever exact word is that only Hashem himself knows what that looks like. And it's so that was yesterday's Gemara. Today we're going to have some more study of the Mishnah, but also some more Agadic teaching. So let's share the screen and get to work. Here we go. All right, we gotta pull up our text. Talmud, Shabbos. Here we go. Oh yeah, and our closing line, we discussed how Ein Mikra Yotzei Midei Pshuto, that a verse may have some profound esoteric teaching, but it also has to be understood literally, and this doesn't only apply to the Torah, but it also applies to the Nevi'im and Tanan halachic interpretations. And so we had an interesting insight to the story of, or the comment of Rav Kana, that he knew the entire Talmud, but at 18, when he knew the whole Talmud, he was only then beginning his journey through the rationale of the Talmud, which was a style and a formula of how that was done. Now we're on to New Gemara, Siman Zarot. Zarot, as Rabbi Steinsaltz here explains, is an acronym for Elazar, a unique Zion that's in the name Elazar, Reish for Reish Lakish, Vav, Tav for the Talmidim and the Amoraim, who are going to have the following conversation. So we're going to have a discussion in the analysis of the verses of Tehillim, continuing our earlier analysis of verses of Tehillim. And let us see, it's going to be on the theme of Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, and the positive, and then a little bit some of the negative things that could happen for an unworthy or or for a, well, you'll see. Rav Yirmiyah, Rabbi Elazar. Rav Yirmiyah quotes Rabbi Elazar as teaching. Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, two Torah scholars, Hamechadedim ze lazeh v'halacha, that sharpen one another in the Torah subjects in halacha. Where does this come from? So you can tell already. We spoke about the sword, right? We said, is a sword considered an ornament, or is it considered an ornament, a tool, or obsolete? And we had different opinions. And we brought a pasuk from Tehillim that talks about a warrior wearing a sword, and that was the proof to the opinion that says that a sword is not only an implement of war, but also an ornament. And the question that Rav Kana discussed was, isn't that verse telling us about how the Torah, which sharpens and is accessible? And so I believe, following along that line of reasoning, we're now going to continue imagining a Torah scholar as a warrior, but not in the literal sense, of course, but when they duke it out, when two Torah scholars debate a subject or a matter, ultimately both come out enlightened with a deeper appreciation for the subject matter that they are studying. How so? Rashi says, Shayalim, they ask each other challenging questions, Umeshivin, and then give responses. But it has to be done not just to one-up the other person, but to really gain clarity. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about our share here. We ask questions, the questions open up new lines of thinking. And so it might be said that this text is describing somewhat the process that we undergo here. So what happens? When they're there to help each other out, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzliach lahem, Hashem ensures that their endeavor should be full of success. Shenemar, v'hadorcha tzlach, v'hadorcha, hadar, and your majesty, tzlach causes prosperity. And then Rabbi Steinsaltz here quotes the rest of the pasuk, in your majesty prosper, ride on in truth, on behalf of truth, and in meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you tremendous things. But right now they're analyzing the words V'hadarcha tzlach, Hashem's majesty should cause success. Al tikra v'hadarcha, don't read your glory, your majesty. Ela v'chadadcha tzlach, but when you sharpen one another by engaging in this intellectual exercise, tzlach, you will find success. Not only when you are chadadcha, you are sharpening one another, there's success. And by the way, I just want to point out, you're wondering, where do you get from hadarcha to chadadcha? So although this is a less conventional and less common formula, there are certain letters that in appearance are quite similar, and there's a certain degree of interchangeability, certainly for the purpose of a drasha of this sort. And so, hey and ches are somewhat similar. Dalid is the same as a dalid. Reish and dalid are somewhat similar. And so v'chadarcha and v'hadarcha, in a certain medrashic kind of formula, have something that makes them appear alike. And so v'hadarcha, v'chadarcha, that when you sharpen one another, you'll be successful. Not only are they successful in their endeavor, they are upgraded. They are elevated to greatness. Where would you see that they would be elevated to greatness? Because the pasuk continues and says, Slach, Rechav, success, ride on, I think is how we might want to translate that. Let's see, Rabbi Steinsaltz does so. Prosper, ride on. So that indicates some kind of elevation. Okay, so two Torah scholars work together. They sharpen each other. Their journey is successful. They find greatness. What if the Torah study is not for the value and the virtue of Torah, but for some kind of alternate value? What might be another reason to study Torah? Maybe you want a prestigious seat in shul, or maybe you want to be able to pick fights with other machers. So if you can engage in Torah, you might be able to, make the rabbi's life a little miserable. And so
Shidduch.
For a shidduch. So certainly you should study Torah regardless, but what we're talking about over here, the special contribution and value of Torah, that's going to be for those that are studying Lishma. Let's see what, yes.
The one word that bothers me in the English, where does it come from in the Hebrew? Meekness. We're talking about everything which is the opposite of meekness, the sword, the battle. Where does Rabbi Steinsaltz pick that from? What Hebrew word does he come to meekness?
Here, although this is not the primary, what you're reading here is actually not in the text of the Gemara. But Steinsaltz provided us with the entire text of the pasuk. So here,
Yeah, but what would lead him to add a word?
V'hadorcha slach, in your glory be victorious, rechav, and ride on, al dvar emes, on words of truth, on good causes, v'anova or v'anva tzedek, and what is anova?
Anivus.
Anivos, modesty, humility, meekness. So, Roberto, you're wondering why would you translate anova as meekness instead of humility or modesty? I hear you. That's how this translator chose.
Okay.
Good question. Good question. I mean, you're right. Maybe I would have translated a little differently. Let's see how the Gemara continues. But that's something worthy of.
We should only have a nova and worry how to translate it.
Oh, very good.
That's a Tznius guy saying that.
What if you're learning Shalai Lishma? So I gave you a translation, but I want to share with you what we can infer from here, what this means. Maybe you don't actually care to understand the Torah. You just want to have fun. You just want to have the thrill, or you just want to go on some kind of, intellectual exercise. Talmud loimer al dvar emes. You have to be seeking the truth. If you're interested in finding the truth, you'll be successful and find it. And then that will take you on to great heights. But if all you're interested is having fun or doing some kind, just to show your intellectual prowess and the Torah is your playground, well, then that's not great. That's not the ideal state. So advar emes, it has to be focused and intent on uncovering the truth. This would be, it's not linked over here. What if you're very full of gaiva, haughtiness? You're really getting into yourself. It has to be with humility, or in the translation that we found over here, with meekness. So, Rebberal, I wouldn't say that meekness is the wrong translation. It's not a common way that we understand anivos. So again, learn Torah, go at it with your friend, gesundheit. Just make sure that your agenda is the truth. Make sure you're full of humility, so you'll hear the other person's opinion and you'll be able to reconfigure and reassess your understanding. And then we continue, if you follow this formula, you'll be zoiche to have acquired Torah, to really have the Torah that was given miyamin from Hashem's right hand. And the verse continues, which he translates here, let your right hand lead you to awesome deeds. But in this context, we're talking about the person receiving the Torah, which is called Yeminecha, Hashem's right hand. If you want to see our Steinsaltz's translation, here we go.
Rabbi,
yes.
Is the word anava used to describe Moshe?
Yes. Yes.
It's kind of a positive.
Yeah, anava is a positive. Even the context of this pasuk, it's positive. But I think you're correct that in our understanding of the word meek, there's usually not a positive connotation. It's usually unwillingness to inject yourself where you're needed. So meekness is you have something to say, and you should say it, and you don't say it, right? Or you have something to do, and you don't do it. And that is with a negative connotation, which I guess further crystallizes why Rebberal was perplexed at the choice of that word as a translation, when anava can equally mean humility, and that would be a positive. Shikach, Professor, that's indeed is the sense over here. But again, that's generally the challenge of studying or using a translation. Is the translation many times can lose the nuance that's in the original language. Just flipping here through the Ben Yoyada to see if he has anything major that we should add before we move on. All right, there's some interesting gematria, but it's a little too complicated for right now. All right, we'll proceed. So here, this is like the first round. This is a verse in Tehillim, and we've understood it. We gave it a drasha that understands this. He's talking about how you should study Torah, sharpen each other, go to battle, but make sure you're seeking the truth with humility, and you'll be zocheh to receive the Torah. Some more on this subject. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, what does it mean? Sorcha yeminecha. The first translation was you'll get the Torah which comes from the right hand. Here it says zoichim. This is a different explanation. Zoichim lidvarim shenemru biyamina shel Torah. You will merit to receive the stuff that are portrayed in the Torah as being received in the right, or I would probably even translate it a little differently. Zoichim lidvarim shenemru biyamina shel Torah. You'll get the things that are described in the Torah. What does that mean? Well, let's see. Others have this idea, this notion conveyed by Rav Yosef bar Chama in the name of Rav Ch6 in the following formula. There's a verse that says, this is recited by many people in the Zos HaBracha. I'm sorry, Zos HaTorah. So the end we say, so it means literally length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. So Rav Ch6 asks, what does it mean? What is the meaning of this? Length of days in the right and in the left. Ela bimina oirech yamim ika.
Rabbi, somebody once said sarcastically about Osher v'Kavod, Imein Osher ein Kavod.
It reminds me, we're smack in the middle of a sentence, but it reminds me of a very tragic. It's not a true story, but it's sad and true. Where there was in the old country, usually the city had a Shtutz Kvir, the guy that was running the main manufacturing plant that employed half the city or more, and they were also able to fund a lot of the Jewish work. And so naturally, when people wanted to solicit, they would also ask his advice. And unfortunately, and they would always come to him, ask advice, and leave with a check. Tragically, his fortunes changed, and he lost the factory, and he was no longer the man of the town. And he complained to the rabbi. He said, "Ich verstehe nicht. Mela, they can't collect the check. I understand, but my brain didn't disintegrate. I still have the same chachma." Tragically, not realizing that sometimes your barrel, I think you're saying, Oisher v'chavod. Sometimes, tragically, we could make the mistake of abandoning a person if they don't have the Oisher. Of course, that's not the right thing, but that's that. But let's go back to the Gemara. The verse says, "Oirech yamim b'mina oirech yamim ika oisher v'chavod leika." Are we saying that there is such a thing as oirech yamim, as a promise absent of Oisher v'chavod wealth? Ella, what we're saying is, l'mayminim ba, those who engage in life with the yamin, Rashi, shel Torah, shemeshafshefin taimeyim b'diktok ubayrim kimin hamiyumenes l'malacha. They comb through the Torah, and they really go through it. So then, oirech yamim ika, then they could be worthy of length of days, and certainly along with this devotion to Torah can be wealth and honor. People that study Torah but only with the left hand. Again, this is not here to be offensive to our dear left-handed brothers and sisters, but in Hebrew language, right indicates strength and devotion, and left indicates engagement, but with a lesser degree. As Rashi points out, they study the Torah, but only like with the left hand. Rashi says, there's another interpretation here. Maimina means they study the way you should, for the sake of Torah. L'mas mi'ilim could be those who study Torah, but not for the sake of Torah. Oisha v'chaved ika, even if you study Torah incorrectly, there could still be a reward of riches and honor. But Eirech Yamim Leika, but maybe the length of days could be missing. Let's read Rabbi Steindl, see how he portrays this. Rabbi Ch6 asks, what is the meaning of length of days is in her right hand, left hand are riches and honor? Is it to say that her right hand has length of days, but they're not riches and honor? It means those who relate to the skilled right hand, meaning you study Torah Lishma, as Rashi said, with proper intention. So then there's length of days and riches. Relate to it with an unskilled left hand, not fully engaged, so there are riches, but not length of days. Bottom line is, studying Torah in any case comes along with great reward. It's always better, much better, to study Torah Lishma. That's where you get the full package, all of the schar that is promised with the Torah. Now, excuse me. No.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how come throughout the length of our studies in the Gemara and Torah studies and everything, it's always talking about a rabbi and a tzaddik and a righteous man, and all of a sudden they pop up with a woman here, female. What does that have to do with it?
It has to, first of all, the verse that we're describing here is a verse in biblical Hebrew. And so the diktuk of the translation of this verse in Tehillim is translated into English in the feminine. Because with Oirech Yamim Bimina in her left hand. And it's a mashal for the Torah, which apparently can occasionally be described in the feminine. But it's a question about the diktuk of the pasuk. But certainly that is not to mean that the Gemara or the Torah wants to exclude women from the conversation. Although there's certainly, because the authors of the Gemara are male, and in Hebrew the default gender is usually, certainly in Mishnaic and Talmudic Hebrew, the default gender is male. So we talk more about men and women. So a lot of that, or half of it is diktuk, is feminine and masculine in other languages. Again, in English, we don't really have gender, to my knowledge, much, except for when there's a relevant gender. So I believe that's the short answer.
Right now we have too many genders.
Not in the Gemara. Let's stop over there. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, along the same subject. So again, we just concluded analysis of two verses in the Torah, in the Tehillim, that talk about the value and the virtue of studying Torah with a friend, sharpening each other's minds, the reward, the riches, the blessings that come, and particularly when they're studied Lishma with the right hand, but even if they're studied with the left hand, there's still great reward associated with Torah. This is a teaching of, this is, I guess, all born out of the teaching of Rabbi Lazar. Now we're on to the next teacher. Remember we had that word Zarus, Zayin, Reish, Vav, Taf. So Zayin we said was for Eliezer. Now we're up to Shimon, who's called Reish Lakish. That's the Reish. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said as follows: Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, Hanoichim Zelazeh, when two Torah scholars are pleasant with one another. Rabbi Steinsaltz's words, they are agreeable to one another. While they engage behalacha, Kadosh Baruch Hu makshiv lahem, Hashem listens into the conversation. Wow. Shenemar oz nidbru yirei Hashem. Then the fearers of Hashem spoke, or something to that effect. In dibor el anachas, and the word dibor usually means a polite, delicate, gentle voice. Shenemar yadber amem tachtenu, as the verse says, He subdues people under us. So here, Dibur is understood to be a calming, soothing, pleasant voice. What does it mean that two Torah scholars would be pleasant to one another, as opposed to jerks, as opposed to being rude, which I guess is definitely an option? So Rashi gives us some more words. Noisim bin noislim. They engage in the Talmudic debate and the Talmudic process. Benachas ruach. Pleasantly. Misaskim kedei sheyilmedu mizeh mizeh, which means essentially they speak in a manner that is going to engender learning from one another, sharing, caring, and that's the tone, that's the way it should work. Yaber amim tachtenu, yashpil. Hashem will lower them. V'chol shiflos benachas. And whenever we talk about this lowness, we're talking about a soothing, what's the word? A standing down. There's an alternative interpretation of this Gemara, which is more that they lead each other towards the accurate interpretation. Of course, our sages tell us, Divrei Chachamim benachas nishmo. Chachamim are heard, and the words are comprehended when they speak delicately, gently, and respectfully. And so it's here we're saying that this is how you should do it because that makes you a mensch. But additionally, if you actually want people to hear your words, usually in a confrontational manner, each side only hears their own voice and they don't really hear the other person's voice. So the more we can have a conversation instead of a confrontation, the better the prospects that the other individual is going to appreciate and hear what you have to say altogether. Now, the thing that is interesting to me is that Dibur, I think elsewhere, is described as a more severe, strict, and commanding kind of tone. So that's interesting to me. Maybe we'll leave it at that for now, but actually, I want to look here. Hang on 1 second. Okay. The Maharsha says you want to check if you want to understand a lot more about this line and about Nachas and Dibur. So in Gemara Makis, another Masech that we'll study, Be'ezra Hashem eventually discusses this idea more at length. So this is the second teaching. So Torah scholars should desire to help one another. They should be in it for the truth. They should be humble. And they should also talk delicately, softly, and in a way that's conducive for dialogue and for understanding one another. Now, the interesting thing, step into a beis medrash, and you'll hear many chavrusas in a yeshiva studying together. Many times, they're speaking in loud tones, and there might be screaming and a lot of vigorous disagreement, but that's all style, not coming from it's an expression of passion, not an expression of heated emotion towards the other person. And so I think when that's the culture, so that's the culture. It's not, but generally speaking, we should try to have a soft, pleasant voice when we're trying to convey ideas that are important. The verse that we just analyzed says like this: Oz nidbra yirei Hashem. Let's open the psukim here. Here's the verse. Oz nidbru yirei Hashem. In this vein, again, this is the translation of the Tehillim, so it's, Malachi, the prophet, which is the full context, not just what the Gemara is teaching us. Oz nidbru yirei Hashem ish el reyehu. Those who revere the Lord have been talking to one another. V'yakshev Hashem v'yishma. Hashem will listen and hear. V'yikosav sefer zikaron. And it'll be written, well, here he translates it, and a book of remembrance has been written, lefanav, before him, l'yirei Hashem, for those that fear him, l'chosh ve'shmai, and those who honor his name. Oz nidbru Hashem. So this pasuk has various translations. So the Gemara asks, what's l'chosh ve'shmai? It says that there'll be a book written for those that fear Hashem, l'chosh ve'shmai, and here he translates esteem his name. The Gemara wants to know what's that word, because besides for that, we've already translated. We're talking about two Torah scholars who talk nicely to each other. What if a person really wanted to observe a mitzvah? But then, nenas v'lo yasa. Something happened beyond their control, and now they cannot perform the mitzvah. You got a flat tire on the way to do a chesed. Malalav akasav kilasa. The Torah says, if you had a machshava, you wanted to do the mitzvah, even if it didn't work out, you still get credit. Afilu chishiv lasis mitzvah. Wow. This line is written sometimes in other words. Sometimes you'll see it says, machshava toiva kadosh baruch hu mitzarf l'maisa. When a person has a good machshava, Hashem makes it as if it is so. But here we're saying a person really intended to do a mitzvah, but it didn't work out. The credit card was frozen, so he couldn't make that payment or whatever it is. He really intended to do it. He wanted to do it. Hashem gives him credit. Beautiful. Another teaching. A teaching by Rav Chinin of Aridi. A person fulfills a mitzvah as Hashem instructed. Such a person should not be told of bad news. Now, but certain mitzvahs are complex, many details, many facets, many aspects. A person endeavors to do the mitzvah with all of the intricacy of it exactly as instructed, well then, it's a powerful protection against bad news. A person who observes, who guards, who keeps a mitzvah will not know of bad news. I know this is going to bring up a lot of questions about folks that we know of that do good deeds with great intent and all the details, and sometimes bad things happen to them. I think we have to add this excerpt of the Gemara into that general genre of trying to figure out exactly why sometimes bad things happen anyways. Should we read this? Let's read this. The Ben Yada, he says that if you do a mitzvah as instructed, you don't get bad news. He says like this. You know the word mitzvah? It's a funny word. It's a composite of two different words. Mitz, mem tzadik. What's mitz? Has anybody here ever had mitz?
Stop Muslim. Juice.
Juice. All right, let's see. Mitz vehe. This is referring to two great things. I know mitz, lashon mitzitzas. I think sucking or squeezing out, which juice is that which has been squeezed out. When you eat something that's really sweet, you want to suck out every last ounce of the goodness in the fruit. Some people, they want to lick and take off every little ounce of meat from the bones. Because it's really delicious. When you're sucking or squeezing out with your mouth, it indicates something really yummy, something really delicious. You know what mitz means? A mitzvah, a commandment from Hashem has to be so delicious, has to be so desirable, that you want to get it down to the last drop. So you want to do the mitzvah totally and perfectly, because you don't want to lose even a single ounce, a little drop. This is a reference to the fact that a mitzvah has to be done joyously. Long story short, how do you do a mitzvah? How do you do a mitzvah properly? mitz, every ounce, vav hey with simcha. And then such a person won't have bad news. What does it mean? Rise. He's saying it's talking about a specific kind of bad news. The kind of bad news that ends up being not true, but you've already suffered while you're suffering through the bad news. And although it's a temporary tzara, it's unnecessary, and that makes it really painful. So the Ben Yehoyada's qualifications make it a little more hard to qualify and a little more specific in what you're being protected from. The Marsha, for whichever reason, is not linking on the Gemara. He quotes the Marsha and says, Kamara means that Hashem's name is reflected in the word mitzvah. Because that's very interesting. This is a little bit Kabbalistic or Gematria kind of related. But the word mitzvah is a reflection of the word Yud Kei Vav Kei. How so? Well, the final two letters is Vav and Hey, but Mem and Sadik. According to the formula of At Bash, where the first letter of the Aleph Beis and the last letter of the Aleph Beis, and then Beis and Shin are all interchanged, Mem and Sadik is Yud and Hey. So when a person serves Hashem in a way that's infused with the knowledge that you're serving Hashem, and you're connecting to Hashem in this deep way, well, then that's a powerful protection from bad news. So that is an interesting perspective. Oh, the Marsha is linked over here. But anyways, that's that Gemara. Should we continue, or any comments before we move on? All right. Amar Ravasi v'itema Rabbi Chanina. Ravasi taught, or maybe it was Rabbi Chanina. Afilu hakadosh baruch hu goyzer gzeir. Even if there is a gezerah against the person, who mivatla, Hashem can still cancel the gezerah for a person who does mitzvahs in this beautiful way. Shenemar, Basher Dvar Melech, Shiltoin, Umi lo yomer loy ma tase. Koheles states, inasmuch as a king's command is authoritative and no one can tell him, hey, what are you doing? And then the next pasuk says, Shomer mitzvah layeda davara. So even if there's a gezerah against him, a decree against him, says the Gemara, based on the reading of Koheles, that a person who observes the mitzvah, shomer mitzvah, a person who guards a mitzvah, they'll know no bad news. And shomer mitzvah, our Gemara seems to understand, is a reference to doing the mitzvah in this perfect, deep, and down to the last drop kind of way. And they will also have davar. They won't know davara. What's a davara? Is a davara something bad, or is it a report of bad news? So the Ben Yehoyada would say, this word davara is reflective of my understanding that you won't have bad news that will cause you to have to go crazy, and it ends up not being true. The Ben Yehoyada here says it a little differently. That the shomer mitzvah, a person who's really meticulous in mitzvahs, he himself can nullify a gezerah. And this doesn't apply to every time, every random person, but a real shomer mitzvah like Moshe Rabbeinu was able to be mevatel the gezerah of the golden calf. We're going to read on Sunday, Mincha, about how Hashem wants to destroy the Jewish people. And Moshe, in appealing to Hashem, Moshe appeals to Hashem. Ultimately, the gezerah is overturned. And this is an instance of a shomer mitzvah. An observer of mitzvahs can undo, so to speak, can cancel Hashem's plans. As we're going to recognize, we'll read by Mincha, Lama Yemer Mitzrayim, Shuv Mecha Inapecha, V'nochem Al Lamecha, that Moshe insists that Hashem forgive. And Yeshua also complains to Hashem when they have a failure in one of the battles. I think this is the battle of Ai. Or maybe it was the next battle where they were going to be ganged up on by a large number of nations. And Yeshua says, Hashem, you got to protect us. What are people going to say? So anyways, interesting stuff. Important stuff. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Abba quotes the famous Reish Lakish. Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Hamakshivim Zelazeh. Two Torah scholars listen to one another. Be'halacha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shemei B'Koil, and Hashem listens to their voice. Shenemar. This is in Shir Hashirim. Hayesheves beganim, Chaverim, Akshivim lekoilecha hashmiyeni. And those who sit in gardens, friends are listening to their voices. Hashmiyeni. It makes me hear it. Who hears it? So this is talking about two Torah scholars who listen to one another. They learn from one another. What are ganim? What are gardens? So Rashi says that's a reference to batei medrashos, yeshivas, places of Torah study. Chaverim akshivim, when friends listen, zelazeh, to one another. Ani oimer shishmuni koilam ve'en. Hashem says, I'm going to hear that voice, and I'm going to respond in kind and in a favorable manner. The Gemara continues, Im einatem oisim kain, but if they don't listen to one another, garmin the shechina shemistalekas miyisrael, they cause the shechina to abandon, to leave, to depart from Israel. Shenemar rachdoidi udmei. Song in Shir Hashirim, it says that you can have a scenario where run away my beloved, that the beloved could run away. And so the Gemara here understands that when two friends, chaverim, are not makshivim lekoilecha, they don't listen to one another, they could chase away the shechina, so to speak, from the Jewish people. Rashi, Brach Doidi Basrei Ksiv. Rashi says the next verse talks about Brach Doidi, where there could be a scenario of where the beloved runs away. All right, let's do a little more. Amar Rabbi Abba, Baba Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Another teaching of Rabbi Abba in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, two Torah scholars or more. Hamagdilim zela ze b'halacha. Mad Gilim, sorry, Rashi, Mad Gilim, Ma'asvin Ze'ezev ha'omer boy nilmad, v'novim ben shneinu hoyel ve'ein lono rav l'amdenu. Hamad Gilim Zela Zeh b'halacha. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates this to mean they make a mistake. They make each other make a mistake. Rashi understands this differently. They gather up, they say, hey, buddy, let's learn. Let's figure this out. We don't have any teachers. So I'm not sure what exact word the Rashi would use over here, but basically Madgilim, according to, actually I think I do know. You put up a flare, you put up a flag and say, hey, who's going to learn with me? We don't have a teacher, but let's figure this out. So when you do that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Oyavan, Hashem really loves it. Shenemar, V'diglu alai ahava. The verse says in Shir Hashirim, his banner, Digloi, alai ahava, over me is love. So although maybe it's not an ideal form of learning, they send up this flag, they get together, Amarava, and Hashem loves it. Amarava hu de yadi surta dishmata. This is only a scenario where they have a basic understanding of learning. Rashi shayr shadavar sas lomdum mirabam. They have a basic framework to be engaged in Torah study. And with the less l'hurava b'masa limig marmine. What happens? Two folks are on a plane, and there's no Rosh Yeshivas, and there's no Wi-Fi, and they want to learn, and they don't have a teacher. And they say, hey, who wants to learn a little, shtickle Gemara? Assuming we're talking about like an airline like Southwest where you can choose your own seat, because otherwise you shouldn't go pick fights with your airline, or certainly not presently where they'll throw you off in a flash. But long story short, you're without a mentor, without a teacher, but you have a basic framework for learning. You seek out another Torah scholar, and that is a wonderful thing. Hashem loves it. Interesting stuff. Rabbi Steinsaltz learns it a little differently. I think it's the same idea. He says two Torah scholars learn together, even though they might be erring because they're absent a teacher. It's still a wonderful thing. But that's only wonderful if you don't have a teacher. If you have a teacher, of course, you should seek out someone that knows better than you to fill you in. But in the case where you can't, at least you're doing your best. Now we're going to pivot to a different, same style, but not about Torah study. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Abba teaches the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Gadol hamalve yoiser min ha'oiseh tzedakah. It's greater to give a loan to a struggling person even than giving charity. Rashi, lefi she'ein ha'ani bush b'davar. A poor person is the recipient of your generosity. That's wonderful. But there's a degree of shame associated with that gift. But loans, which are a common part of human living and doing business, so there is no shame, and so you're allowing the poor person to get on their 2 feet in a way that allows them to avoid the deep kind of shame that could be associated with taking a handout. And when Meitel Bakis, Rashi, Mois, if you make that person a business partner, that is the greatest virtue of all. Rashi, we're talking about funds, and you put the money lemechsa, which means half of the profit goes to the person who put down the money, and the other half goes to that guy. So Rashi says, you might be wondering, how do we pivot from talking about Torah to a very different topic of giving, the virtue of giving alone? Well, because we're now that we've been quoting Rabbi Abba, who was quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish so much, we're going to throw in another teaching or two that are connected to Rabbi Abba quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Now, my mother taught me long ago that you never want to loan something that you can't afford not to get back. So you should give loans, and that's a good thing. But if you're going to lend something out that you can't afford to lose, odds are that you're going to have a very strained relationship that's not going to end out well. But if you're feeling magnanimous and you want to help a poor person, you want to make a difference, and you can afford to lose it in case it doesn't work out, you can afford to lose it, well, then that is an ideal type of mitzvah. And I recently had a conversation with a young man around, actually a little older than me, around my age, and we both, our careers, I mean, I'm a rabbi and he was in business, but we kind of started out at the same time and we became friends. And occasionally we would check in and talk about what's going on. And recently he told me that Baruch Hashem, he's really made it. He had certain definitions for success. He had certain amounts that he needed to be earning and having in the bank account. And he's far surpassed all of those initial projections and definitions of success. And he finds himself yet really not feeling, enriched, or he doesn't feel that he's made it. And he told me he realizes that the next step for him is he wants to seek out young, starting, entrepreneurs or folks that are interested in getting involved. And he wants to do exactly this. He wants to be some kind of an angel investor, and he wants to get involved, and he wants to mentor and help them, achieve the success that he feels that Hashem was kind to give him to do. And so I told him that what you want to do is really virtuous, and it sounds like a very, there's a lot of beautiful passages in the Jewish tradition endorsing that behavior. I said, just make sure that you know the risks involved before you do it, and you're willing to write those losses off, because otherwise you could start out trying to do a mitzvah, and it turns out to be a very hellish experience for the recipient of your kindness. And the reason why I was able to tell him that is because I know someone else that also went on that route and ended up suing these poor little start out guys that, failed because they probably never should have started that business. But anyways, it's good to help people in a way that can allow them to avoid shame when possible. Let's see one more teaching of Rabbi Abba in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and then we will call it a day. And this one's going to keep you perplexed. And so let's see. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Im Talmud Chacham noikem v'noiter kinachashu. If you'll meet a Talmud Chacham who happens to have the personality of a snake, okay, no, let's read Rabbi Steinsal's translations. A Torah scholar who is vengeful and begrudging, like a snake. Chagreyu al masnecha. You could keep him close. Im am haaretz hu chasid, atada b'shchunasai. But a person that is a very kind, well-meaning individual, but they're an am haaretz, which I'm going to choose to translate here, not as someone that is ignorant, but someone that is abandoning Jewish practice. Al tadar b'shchunasai, don't hang out with that person. Why? Let's see Rashi. You want to have the nasty person on your team. No, that's not what Rashi says. Right? If there's a nasty person in town, buy them over so they're not shooting at you. But Rashi says eventually you'll benefit from his Torah study. Because I believe Rashi is saying that although he appears to be vengeful and begrudging, he's doing it from a place of sincerity and goodness. And you can see a person that abandons Yiddishkeit in a time where abandoning Yiddishkeit was much more, it wasn't a default state, because today many Jews are born without it. It was an act of rejecting Yiddishkeit. So such a person will end up tripping you up and getting you in trouble in your own
Rabbi,
Jewishness. Yes, go ahead.
Rabbi, very difficult to understand if a person's a true Torah scholar. How could he be vengeful and begrudging? He has so many rules and regulations exactly against that.
So probably he's only, if I'm going to give you the apologetics, probably he's only engaging in halakhically mandated grudges and halakhically mandated vengefulness. I'm not embracing this as policy. I'm just telling you how one might explain it. I'll tell you this.
Rabbi, perhaps there's a difference between a Torah scholar and a Yirei Shamayim. You could be a scholar and knowledgeable, to the nth degree.
Yeah, maybe the left side, like we learned before.
I'll tell you, here's where look, I think the basic gist of this Gemara is as we understand it to be. A person that's a Torah scholar, even if there's some personality defects, you'll do better by hanging around them because ultimately you'll learn from them. A person that rejects Torah, he could be a Ziskite, but ultimately it's going to be bad for you because you're going to be influenced in a negative direction by that person. I think that's really how we have to understand it. So we're talking about the guy might be a pain in the tuchus, pardon me, he might be a pain to have around, and he might have a personality disorder, and there's going to be moments of angst and misery, and he's going to do things that might drive you nuts. But your spirituality will remain intact. This is, I think, the literal interpretation. Whereas you have a nice person, but if their whole agenda and they want to try to take you away from your Yiddishkeit, so he might be a fun person to be around, it might be pleasant, but your spirituality is going to hurt. That, I think, is the pshat that I'm comfortable with. That is what I think it's going to be. But we could choose to tweak it and understand it in different ways. A Talmud Chacham could be describing not just a scholar, because we discussed previously, a scholar is not necessarily a good person or virtuous. They could be doing it all for ego and all for, for alternative purposes. But if they're a Talmud Chacham, they're engaged and they desire to continue to grow. This is my second shot. Maybe they're also, if they're willing to grow, they'll work on their character flaws, and so they'll end up becoming more pleasant with time. I don't know if that works. I don't know if that lines up with the reality. Dr. Hammer, maybe you'll fill us in. Some people are born with, personality disorders of sorts and things, and unfortunately, because it's not easy, there ends up being a lot of misery associated with that kind of unpleasantness.
People are born with different temperaments, but I wanted to ask about something else. You're making it sound like it's black and white. They're two different categories. What about the good person with values and everything, maybe Jewish or not, by the way?
Right?
You're breaking up, Bert.
You're suggesting don't hang out with that person because it's not a good thing.
Well,
I know you didn't mean to, but that's what.
That's my explanation, or that's my understanding of this passage in the Gemara. This teaching is saying that a person would do better to hang out with a person that's growing in their Judaism, even if they're nasty, than a person that's abandoning their Judaism, even if they're nice. I know that I'm not telling you how to incorporate this into your life. I'm just saying I think that is the truest understanding of this text, or the literal understanding of this text.
Rabbi,
Yes.
it's like this Russian Torah scholar. He says you have to work on your goy.
Yeah. Hold on one more second. All right, now let me read for you another line or two that provides some perspective over here.
I think it's just a mashal that illustrates the rabbi's preference for Torah scholarship that can even overweight the deficiencies of the character, and they try to denigrate the ignorance, even though it is connected with good character. Probably we shouldn't take it literally, but it's just they try to stress the difference between scholarship and ignorance.
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind is, they say keep your enemies close. So if the person is trouble, you want to keep them close. Wrap them around your waist. Make sure you have them in your court.
Yeah, but the example of using a snake and to wrap the snake, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. They'll kill you altogether. It's weird that they would use a snake and wrap him around yourself. Very interesting.
Yeah, that stresses how much they estimated scholarship.
Yeah. The other thing I say is to consider.
It's not
they
literal.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. Well, first of all, literally, human beings aren't snakes, and they can't wrap around your waist. But also, generally speaking, right, it conveys a certain sentiment. And I think we should also remember that at that time, there was very strong antagonism between these two kinds of people. And, there was a lot of sectarian friction. And so it kind of may have been an either or, choose this team or that team. I think today we can have a more nuanced relationships with different people. And, but anyways, as I said before I read this text, this is going to leave us with a lot of food for thought. And I think that stands to be the case. Shalom Bear, are you here? Yeah. Want to do Chumash today? Mm-hmm. All right, folks. I'm sorry we're going a little late, and this topic really deserves a little more discussion. So maybe on Sunday we can pick up and see if there are any other thoughts that develop
Probably
over
not
Shabbos.
Sunday.
I'm sorry, correct. Not Sunday. Yes, Mark. Thank you. Not Sunday. Monday. We'll pick up Ezer Hashem. Sunday is the fast of the 9th of Av, and we'll be in Shulam.
Lucky for me, I have the bris for Rosalie's grandson Monday.
Mazel
so if
tov.
it's not over, at least I'm at a simcha.
Mazel tov, mazel tov. What wonderful news. Let me just close by let's mention once again our dear Dr. Mr. Peter Sal, Yisrael Shloima ben Reb David, right? Yisrael Shloima ben David. Our Gabbai. Today's his yard site, his Neshama Shavan Aliyah. We should have only good news for all of Klal Yisrael. We should be zocheh that Tisha B'Av gets canceled with the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkenu. May it be so. And have a wonderful day. Stand by. You're welcome to rejoin the link to study Chumash with
Shabbos.
Shabbat Shalom.